Hi all, I'm a little late in getting this video to you this week. Module 4, week 4. I was waiting until I looked at your reading checks. So some weeks I like to do it ahead of the reading check. Some weeks I like to see what you're thinking and talking about and then chime in. But we seem to constantly be facing new crises. And in light of yesterday's events at the US Capitol, many of us were not able to concentrate, me included. So instead of looking at your reading checks, I'm just going to go ahead and talk about the readings and what I want you to get from them, right? And how they fit together. So this set of readings is about care in education, right? So for many of us that have been teachers, mentors, or in some other educational role akin to that, we don't need philosophers to tell us that teaching is a fundamentally relational act. We know that, right? Relationships and relationships of care are central to our work. Our work can't happen without it. And yet, philosophers do talk about this because what that means, a relationship of care, can be understood in different ways. So let's start with Nell Noddings, who is a preeminent philosopher of education. She is a preeminent philosopher of the ethics of care. And Nell Noddings states the obvious for those of us that are educators, that teaching is one of the foremost personal relations, and it's a fundamentally relational act. She brings up ideas of the kind of relationship that a teacher and a student need to have for it to be efficacious. It's very much in line with Freire's ideas of mutuality and dialogue. She isn't talking about the social or political context. It's very much a colorblind philosophy, and that's something that we can critique and discuss. And there are also parallels between her philosophy and, for example, what Freire talks about in terms of mutuality and mutual humanization and the ability of the teacher to listen, to allow students to name their world. And what does that look like in an ethic of care? Which is different than a teacher that says they're caring, right? Because a teacher can believe that they're caring and a student can experience that not as a caring relationship. I'm sure we've all had those experiences, and there's plenty of research that documents this as well. In particular, the work of Angela Valenzuela on subtractive schooling really digs into this idea of how students at a predominantly Latino high school in Texas, I believe, their teachers felt that they cared for their students and that they were doing what caring teachers should do, and the students felt excluded, isolated, not seen, not heard. They didn't experience it as care. So there was this big disconnect between what teachers felt they were doing and what students experienced. And one of the things that's useful in Nodding's work is that she really articulates this difference between identifying as caring and being driven by an ethic of care. And an ethic of care requires humility, it requires listening, it requires mutuality, and it requires, in particular, that we care about meeting the expressed needs of our students and not just the assumed needs of our students. So assumed needs, we all have them. We all think we know what our students need, right? We also have all sorts of structures that are telling us what our students need. We can think about standards, for example, as one type of assumed need of what students need to know, right? But an ethic of care is driven by listening to students' expressed needs and then seeing our role as the educator as fundamentally being driven about meeting those expressed needs, right? I may think my student needs to know X, and my student is telling me that they need to know Y. And we can see this in Freire's work, right? And we can see how that comes out in dialogue. So in Freire's work, we see this in the idea of a problem-posing pedagogy where we name the world and we ask questions about it and we make meaning out of it, as opposed to coming in and banking with what we think you need to know. So in many ways, we could overlay these two philosophies on each other, and they are using different language to describe this same phenomenon. Both of them require a teacher to step back and to relinquish some of the power over. It requires that the teacher not feel that they are the authority, right? And not authority as an expert, although that can be part of it too, but that I am the one in charge, right? I know what you need. I know what we need to do, and I set it up. And I love you, but you have to follow what I'm saying. And both of these approaches or ways of thinking about an ethic of care require a teacher to relinquish some of the power over and shift into a relationship of power with, right? Which often even teachers who think that they're caring aren't doing, right? But there's a mutuality about it. And when we're in power with, this idea of dialogue becomes clear that Freire writes about. Now, Freire reminds us that there is nothing, he says, I wrote it down, there's nothing more concrete than humans in relationship with other humans. That this is sort of a central, concrete element of life, of what it means to be human. And so if you take that idea of humanization that Freire talks about, an ethic of care in the teacher-student relationship is central to that mutual humanization, because there is nothing more concrete than a human in relationship with another human. And an ethic of care is going to dictate how that relationship is, right? And that those of us who have been positioned as oppressors, as having power over, are learning how to be in a relationship, right? We're learning how to instead have power with, and we learn that in part through dialogue, through listening, through having students express their needs, and then we think about how we can meet those needs, how we can match students' needs with skills, knowledge, dispositions, individuals, etc., etc. Nell Noddings talks a lot about empathy. And I would challenge, if I were talking to Nell Noddings, but I'm not, so I'm talking to you, I would challenge us to think about not only empathy in an ethic of care, but solidarity. Because if what she's describing is true, and we can see how it's overlaid on Freire, then it would call on us not only to feel for students, to feel with students, but to be in a relationship of solidarity with students, where our learning and our humanity are inextricably bound with one another. So that when we act in the world through praxis, remember we learned about that in the Freedom module, the way that theory and action are interwoven to engage in praxis, that when we engage in praxis, it is in a position of solidarity with our students. Okay. I don't want to say a whole lot about the Dean Brackley piece about Jesuit education. I included it because as members of a Jesuit educational community, we are all used to hearing the expression cura personalis, and these days also cura apostolica, right? So as you think about the Dean Brackley piece, I want you to think about if cura personalis is in line with an ethic of care, or is it something different? Is it a caring teacher, or is it a teacher enacting an ethic of care? Another way to think about it is cura personalis in the kind of Jesuit pedagogy that Brackley is laying out? Or in this case, it's not Jesuit pedagogy so much as the structures of Jesuit education, what it should do. Is it akin to Freire's pedagogy, but for privileged folks? Maybe not, but maybe it is. But just some questions to think about, like where do you see this approach to education fitting in here? And it's one that we're all, at least at the moment, deeply familiar with because we're in it, either as students or as teachers. Okay, bell hooks. So the first thing that you need to know is please write bell hooks' name correctly, so she doesn't capitalize any of the letters in her name. I encourage you to look into why that is. She has a very thoughtful philosophical reason for eschewing capitalization, and I want to let her tell you. But please write her name the way that she would like it written. So bell hooks, no capitalization, 2 words. Bell Hooks is her pen name. Her real name is Gloria Watkins. She is brilliant. She's a brilliant philosopher, thinker, teacher, writer. Bell Hooks, and we've read some Bell Hooks, right? But in this week, we're reading Bell Hooks' take on beloved community, which is an expression, as she acknowledges, that comes from Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And beloved community, in many ways, is a community driven by love and by care, but across difference, right? And part of what she's arguing is that the anti-racist struggle is an ethic of care. And that if we are driven by an ethic of care, so now this is me inserting, but if we are driven by an ethic of care as educators, we must engage in an anti-racist struggle. That you cannot tease these two things apart. That care and love, if an ethic of care requires that we listen to and aim to meet the expressed needs of our students, and our students are telling us that they face racism, that they face oppression, how do we meet those needs? Right? We have to, and if an ethic of care, if mutual humanization requires that we act in solidarity, then that anti-racist work is fundamental to an ethic of care. They're inseparable. Hooks also tells us that an affirmation of difference, not the denial of difference, but the affirmation of it, is love. And we can think about that in relation to anti-racist struggles as well, right? If anti-racism is love, the affirmation of difference is love. And that there can be no love without those. It's a really different way for white folks to think about love. Hooks also reminds us that power and the way power flows, and that if we are engaged in a relationship where we have power over, expressing power as power over can never be anti-racist. Power with, power to, those can be anti-racist, but exerting our power over is not. One of the things that she describes in this piece on beloved community, she doesn't name it explicitly, but it's one of the things that I see when I read it as a white female educator, is that creating a beloved community, one that is anti-racist, that affirms difference, that is driven by love and care and mutual humanization and acting in solidarity towards justice, or as past readings talk about, prophetic justice. Cornel West talks a lot about prophetic justice and also reminds us that justice is just love in public. So if that's the case, engaging in beloved community, working towards it in our classrooms specifically, requires deep critical introspection. It's not possible without deep critical introspection, particularly as a white teacher. Beloved community also, if critical introspection is central to it, sorry, you hear my kids in the background, it also thus welcomes conflict, loving conflict. Right? It doesn't shy away from conflict, but says, let's ask the difficult questions together. And let's affirm differences. Not in there are nice people on both sides, right? We already know that when we're reading Bell Hooks, she is talking to us about anti-racist struggles, right? But within that, what does that look like? It welcomes that critical introspection and loving movement through conflict and through tension, because we affirm differences. We love them. Um, and we listen to one another's expressed needs. And if I layer in the idea from liberation theology and Jesuit pedagogy around epistemic privilege, we not only listen to express needs, but if I am in a position of privilege, if I have been positioned as an oppressor, then I give epistemic privilege to your express needs. They matter more. Because my needs are met broadly, right? By the world, because of how I'm positioned socially. And if I'm not privileging your express needs, if I'm not giving you epistemic privilege in this relationship, can it be a caring, loving relationship? And I just want you to think about that in relation to, and even if we come to K-12, right? K-12 classrooms, how many teacher-student relationships are driven by that? Probably few, in my experience. Okay, which brings us to the article on, this is such a hard word for me to say in Spanish. When I'm speaking Spanish, I always trip over it. Acompañamiento. It's so hard for me to say. This is not a philosophical piece. It draws on theory, and the author is theorizing, but he is not a philosopher. He is an anthropologist. And what we see here, and why I love it, is potentially a practical application of an ethic of care and what that looks like when we attend to context, power, when we acknowledge race, class, language, citizenship, migration. What does an ethic of care look like? And so this brings me full circle back to the beginning when I talked about Nell Noddings being a colorblind ethic of care. And I don't think, and I think Sepulveda makes this clear, as well as other readings this week, Bahux, Paulo Freire, right? They make clear that an ethic of care is not colorblind and it is not context neutral. It is deeply embedded in one's social and political context and how you are positioned in it. Okay, I'll pause or stop, I should say. Let you soak that in. I look forward to hearing more from you this week, and I wish you well. Take good care of yourselves.